Korean War was a defining conflict of the Cold War era that had lasting geopolitical ramifications. Fought from 1950 to 1953, it pitted communist North Korea backed by China and the Soviet Union against South Korea, aided by a United Nations coalition led by the United States. The ensuing war caused immense destruction and loss of life on the Korean peninsula, while also raising fears of escalating confrontation between nuclear-armed superpowers. This essay will analyze the key causes, course, and consequences of the Korean War with a focus on its broader historical context and impact. In the aftermath of World War II, the Korean peninsula was occupied by Soviet forces in the north and American forces in the south, divided along the 38th parallel. Two separate governments formed with divergent ideologies, communist led by Kim Il-sung in Pyongyang and capitalist, led by Syngman Rhee in Seoul. Tensions rose as both sides laid claim to authority over the entire Korean nation and refused to acknowledge the other. Heightened by the emerging Cold War and ideological struggle between the US and Soviet Union, the superpowers withdrew their occupation troops in 1949 but continued vying for influence. Meanwhile, Kim Il-sung was determined to pursue Korean reunification under communist rule, with backing from Stalin and Mao Zedong, who hoped to destabilize the US-led security framework in Asia. North Korea launched a surprise invasion of South Korea on June 25, 1950, catching UN forces off guard. Initial North Korean advances rapidly overran most of South Korea, but the UN Security Council authorized members to help defend the South. US led the bulk of this force under General Douglas MacArthur. An Incheon landing in September cut off North Korean supply lines, and UN counteroffensives pushed back beyond the 38th parallel, nearing the Chinese border by October. Alarmed by Western forces near its border, China issued warnings and secretly amassed forces. In October 1950, over 300,000 Chinese troops secretly crossed the Yalu River to engage UN forces, catching them by surprise. Heavy fighting saw UN units retreat back south through freezing winter conditions in one of the war's bloodiest episodes. By early 1951, after seesawing battles along new front lines near the 38th parallel, a stalemate set in with neither side able to achieve total victory. The newly inaugurated US President Eisenhower considered using nuclear weapons but reconsidered due to political fallout. Despite ongoing skirmishes and limited offensives, the front remained static for over 2 years of attrition warfare. With the Soviet Union and China continuing to back North Korea and the UN forces implacably opposed to communist rule over the South, peace talks dragged on from 1951 in Kaesong and Panmunjom. A proposed temporary demarcation at the existing front lines was eventually accepted in 1953 after further negotiations. On July 27th, the Korean Armistice Agreement was finally signed, establishing a 4 kilometers demilitarized zone and securing a ceasefire that persists today, if uneasily, with the peninsula still divided. The costly war resulted in over 1 million Chinese casualties and 54,000 US casualties before hostilities ended with no peace treaty. South Korea emerged economically devastated, but established as a non-communist bulwark, while the North became increasingly isolated under the totalitarian rule of its repressive regime. The conflict also boosted US-South Korean defense ties and demonstrated limits to UN power projection versus communist forces backed by major powers like China and the Soviet Union. Cold War tensions continued to simmer in East Asia afterwards. The Korean War marked a crucial early proxy conflict within the global Cold War struggle, as communist and capitalist spheres of influence collided on the peninsula. Its scale, atrocities, and failure to achieve complete victory for either belligerent solidified division of the peninsula along ideological lines that continues to impact geopolitics today. For the US, it highlighted commitments to containing communism and defending allies that shaped subsequent policy in Vietnam and beyond. Overall, the war was a bloody and costly military stalemate that introduced nuclear risks during superpower confrontation and inflicted immense human suffering while postponing Korean reunification that remains elusive.